Welcome to Concerning the Spiritual and Art, a podcast exploring spirituality, consciousness, and the creative process. I'm your host, Martin Benson. All right, y'all, welcome back to the podcast. I have an incredibly special episode for you today with visual artist Katie Niewodowski. And man, this conversation we had was just mind-blowing. We went to so many places, not only talking about her amazing art practice and her experience working with sacred geometry and the flower of life, and how to sort of create a balance between using these geometric structures with more organic, intuitive forms in her work, and how she's sort of grappling with that and dealing with that in her studio. But we also related a lot around yoga practice and meditation. Both of us are yoga teachers. And so we really talked a lot about spiritual practice, not only the sort of nitty gritty of those practices themselves, but the relationship that those practices have to the modern world, and how we're living a very special time where we need to figure out sort of the way to integrate these ancient wisdom traditions with modern life and what that looks like. We also talked a lot about technology and its relationship to sort of how we're evolving as a culture and how we need to counterbalance some of the darker components to our technological advances with more practical connection to the material world, being in nature, more connected to the elements, working with more analog materials, being outside of our phone and outside of screens, and working in the studio with actual material itself, and how important that can be to balance the technological exposure we have on a daily basis. We also touched upon the importance of community, and how community is really what life is all about, and what we need to continue to cultivate and create in these very divisive times. And so there's just so many amazing thoughts and insights that were shared, and we just had such a powerful conversation, and I think y'all are going to just absolutely love it. So here you go, Katie Niewodowski. All right, Katie, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Martin. Thank you so much. I've been really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed just our initial phone call, off record, where we just kind of got to know each other. And I felt like you and I were really resonating on so many ideas and so many topics. And looking at this gorgeous painting behind you, I can't help but to see like the flower of life and how you utilize sacred geometry within a lot of the compositions or structures and imagery within your work. And that's something that I've been like deeply interested in and just fascinated by for a long time. And so I figured that would be like a cool way for us to kind of get the ball rolling today. And I'm curious sort of like how you got into utilizing sacred geometry, discovering it, like what it kind of means to you, and sort of how it plays a part in your process as an artist.
Yeah, so my work is the thing that has most interested me always is connection. And so for a long time, I was working with the ideas of micro and macro, and the way different patterns in the universe are kind of connecting us, our bodies, everything in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw some of these diagrams. I was working with the idea of cellular structures for a long time. And I saw these diagrams of how the flower of life is very much like life itself, like the cell and the egg, like reproducing and creating this beautiful form. And so that was really inspiring to me. And so using the actual geometry in the work is a somewhat newer kind of development over the last couple of years. But the idea of the cell I've been working with for a really long time. And so this is like kind of a structural way of putting that together. And even now I'm kind of like still working with the tension of like how to keep the organic as well as the geometric, and like how to like dance with those binaries.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is so fascinating, like how like the flower of life, and for those out there that aren't familiar with the flower of life, it's a really like ancient diagram. I mean, Da Vinci was playing with it, but we can see examples of it being utilized in cultures across the globe, across time. And so it is really interesting how it's like a two-dimensional representation of like cellular mitosis, of like how cells split. And so like when you look at like how an egg splits, after it's been after what's the word I'm looking for? It's been fertilized or germinated, you know what I mean? It splits, and it splits in this exact form. And it's just so fascinating. And from it, you get this incredible matrix essentially that you can create all kinds of forms out of as well. But I think it's so beautiful the way that you are sort of like playing with this tension of like the geometric and the organic, because they are united. They are like one thing, the kind of almost two aspects or expressions of it in some way. And
Right.
so like, how do you approach like doing that in terms of like building out your composition? Like I'm just looking at the painting behind you and I see the flower of life pattern kind of like over your, I guess would be your right shoulder,
Yeah.
kind of building out in that space. But then you see these beautiful sort of undulating like wave patterns that are kind of more organic, kind of enveloping that space on top of it. Like, are you like having any sort of like formal sense of composition, or are you just kind of intuiting it as you piece these things together?
Well, for a while when I started to become interested in the geometries, the work went much more just kind of geometric for a little while as I was familiarizing myself with those shapes and how they work and the elegance of how to put them together, how to build them, like, equilaterally and all of that. So I had to kind of go there first, but there's a certain, prior to that, I was making a lot of work that was more like call and response, or like create a move and then respond to that move. And there's so much experimentation in that that I absolutely adore and live for. And like, that's what really like gets those kind of creative juices flowing for me.
Yeah, for sure.
So what I found with the geometry is like, as elegant as it was like a little constricting, like, so it's like now I've got to stay with it, like color within the line, so to speak, because it's like these forms. And so I started to really like over the last year think I would love to figure out a way to like kind of can they both coexist like visually, can I make it work? And so with this most recent painting, I started with, just like doing some pours on the canvas and adding water and allowing those shapes to kind of emerge. And then I responded to that to see where, like, how can I fit the geometry into this? How can I get it to balance, both in terms of, composition as well as contrast, because it's like you introduce geometry and it's like, bam, that's, it's powerful.
Definitely.
And so it's like, how can both of these things work together and find that dance? And so this was the first painting where I really started to feel like, okay, now I'm kind of grooving with it.
Yeah, that's so exciting, Katie. Oh my God. It's so exciting when you kind of like crack the code a little bit and figure out sort of like how, like, because what a lot of people out there, I mean, artists all know this, but people who maybe aren't like committed to any sort of creative practice, like it is a lot of just problem solving and a lot of visual problem solving, a lot of experimentation. And then once you kind of figure out some of those quirks about it, then you just like can let go and trust your intuition and play and flow once you've kind of figured out how to do it. And I think if this is the first one that you've kind of opened up, I can't wait to see sort of like how it unfolds and evolves, because I do think that this relationship between that organic, expressive, sort of earthly quality that comes through is such an amazing balance to the structure of the geometry, because I mean, that's really how I guess it kind of plays out in the cosmos. There is this underlying like mathematical structure. There is a sense of proportion, relationship. We think about just even like Fibonacci numbers and the spiral. We think also about, the flower of life, but from those structures, even like molecular structures, which are very specific, then we get like this sort of undulating patterns of the way water sort of flows through wetlands, or the way that sort of mushrooms kind of grow on a tree or whatever. There's this organic, almost seemingly kind of playful, creative process that happens, but underneath it, it's grounded in the very specific structure and a very specific sort of design, so to speak. When I first discovered sacred geometry, it just like blew my mind, because it does point to this fact of like, there is an interrelatedness to all of life. And there is some kind of coherence underneath the surface of what seems incoherent or what seems chaotic. There is a structure there. It's mysterious as all hell, but like it's definitely there, and we can see it through geometry and math. And so
Right.
I find that to be just a really rich area to investigate, not only as an individual human being, but as an artist specifically, because we're dealing with these visual forms all the time.
Right. That's what I was going to say, especially as an artist. It's like this kind of original creation, or this creation that continues to happen and expand in our universe. It's so inspiring because
Mm-hmm.
and then you are this little creator yourself and trying to like, find ways to structure this stuff. It's
Yeah.
super
It
exciting.
it is amazing. It's like the old alchemical saying, like as above, so below, as within, so without, like the micro, macro, like everything is a fractal, like self-referential sort of
Yeah.
explosive creative force of life. And it's in everywhere we look, everything we see, it's just all around us all the time. And I think sometimes that's part of what the role of an artist is to point out these things that we can totally overlook or totally like, just pass off as being insignificant and be like, no, look at this. This is the whole web of life right here. That's like
Right.
weaving all of us. We are all a connected entity that's like one thing, like almost like one sort of ecosystem. And we're all just kind of playing a part in like holding up the homeostasis in some way.
Totally. There's no better like feeling than if like a friend or somebody sends me some picture of something that was happening in nature and says like, "Oh, this reminds me of your art," because
Mm-hmm.
it's like if I can point one person
Yeah.
back to that, like what's happening
Mm-hmm.
outside, it's then that's a success in my mind.
For sure. Because I think our culture is so keen on like creating a sense of like banality, and like things can be so mundane, or things can be feeling kind of insignificant. And I think part of our role, I guess, as artists, as creatives, is to sort of initiate people back into that curiosity and that sense of wonder and that sense of like questioning in a feeling of like awe, kind of questioning, but not like questioning in a state of fear or a state of like resistance, but a questioning like, what is this place? Like, what are we doing here? Like in a really beautiful, almost childlike way.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to get like caught up in just the practicalities of everyday living and
Yeah.
forget that we're spinning on a rock in the
Right.
middle of infinite space where all this beauty is surrounding us all the time, and there's so much mystery enveloping everything we do and look at. We can't forget it because
Right.
it's so in some paradox, it's so easily forgotten, even though it's the most majestic, magical thing you could ever imagine. It's
Yeah.
mind-blowing where we are.
Yeah. And for myself, for my own process to like continuously be right, because we got to do the jobs and the
Yeah.
this, that. And it's like to get into that place, it's like
Mhm.
there's no greater like
Yeah.
moment space to tap into.
For sure. And you were mentioning, before we got online, how you had a really wonderful start to your day doing some yoga and meditation and I think this is something you and I both connect on because I think we both have done teacher training and are yoga teachers as well, and like really diving into that practice. And I find that to be such a deep well of inspiration for me to be able to like turn the light of consciousness inward and really do that inward journeying to not only like cultivate connection and openness and understanding of our own sense of self, but like then pulling that out and bringing that into relationship with all the things that we do. I'm curious how you began that part of your journey in terms of self inquiry, spiritual practice, yoga, meditation. Like, where did that begin for you?
Yeah, I think that I've always been a seeker of some kind. I grew up in Florida in a very conservative Catholic family, and I just always found there were little, cosmic breadcrumbs along the road of like things that I was like, okay, this is truth. This feels like truth. And it like in personal struggles that I've gone through in 2007, I started doing yoga, hot yoga on a regular basis, and it changed my life. I
Wow.
was like, it was the first time I had the monkey mind. It's like I had no idea just how spun out the mind could be and
Oh my
was
gosh.
until I started to do this practice. And I would remember like driving home from one of those classes, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, my hands are on the steering wheel. Like I'm here. And it's such a powerful experience. And so then, so then I started doing that every day. And I'm like, if I'm still doing this in a year, I'm going to go to teacher training. And I did. And I'm still teaching. I'm teaching a class later today.
Wow.
But it's also like, even within that practice, the message, kind of the lesson that I keep getting over and over again is like, anything can become an attachment, like even asana, even yoga practice. And so it's like, my practice now is like a gentler form of yoga, kind of like allowing the day to determine like, what is the practice of the day going to be, ways to go inside. But it's like you said, it's all about connecting to the inside, because I think it's very easy for us to suddenly like confuse this kind of outward thing, like a yoga class or a church or whatever it may be, with the thing itself. And it's here. Like you can be sitting in your car, you can be washing the dishes and connect with that place. Yes. And so I kind of feel like my life journey has been that lesson coming up over and over again, to not get too attached to any one thing, and just, my big practice these days is journaling.
Cool.
And every single night. I don't, it's like Julie Cameron was right about that writing. It's like, I don't do it in the morning, but I don't miss a single night. It's just, but for that very reason of, there's something that happens where it helps me to tap into myself, my own wisdom. It's like, that's what people, it's like, you have it. And and I feel like that's what a lot of these structures, capitalism, patriarchy, is afraid of. It's like us getting in touch with that power.
Yeah. Oh my God. That's so many amazing little nuggets you threw out there that are just like totally resonating with, especially this idea of like, it's so interesting. Like as you start, like, especially like a yoga practice, like in a serious, like committed way, you can get very intense about it and very militaristic about it. And almost like you don't have any like wiggle room for flexibility. It's like, you got to do it this way, this time, this day, every day, like this. And and it's so funny, a lot of like teachers that I know, yoga teachers, or people who've been practicing for decades or longer, they start to always come to this more gentler place. Like for me, like when I came across, like I definitely still do a lot of like more what we might be called like a yang style, like asana, like more vigorous physical practice, but not nearly as much as I used to. Yin yoga is like my safe haven. Like I love the restorative. I love the slowing down. I love the savoring part of those practices, because it is important to always strike that sort of balance. Just like we were talking about with your paintings, like, right? Like trying to find this balance of these sort of different sort of dichotomies that are really united. They work together, but when you get too committed or too attached to one over the other, that's where you start to shift the balance within. And so always being conscious of that. And attachment is like, that is the game, essentially, in my mind, is like always figuring out and noticing where you're attached to like a sense of who you think you are, attached to like what your opinions are, attached to what you created, attached to the roles that you play in your life, attached to like a certain outcome that you're really like driving for. Like the letting go is really the practice, in my mind, is learning how to like let go and to trust and to like move with more effortlessness through the world. And then with painting, I feel like it's a struggle there too, of attachment all the time. I find that in my own practice, like attached to a certain way of working, attached to a certain quality of imagery or color. And that's probably one of the hardest places for me to let go, is within painting, because I feel like I'm doing something so interesting, but I also can feel that I'm like, I can feel the fetters, I can feel them come in.
Yeah, it's that attachment within the art studio is like it's a killer of creativity, because I feel like my job, and like kind of connected to something you were saying earlier about play, is to continuously get into a place where the experimentation is still alive. And that's a scary place in making, because it's like, yeah, you don't know that this move or that thing is going to look good, but if you don't take those kind of risks in the practice and keep the play alive, it dies. It loses its, magic.
It's so true. It's so true. And I feel like I go through stages personally, like where I'm doing a lot more experimenting, playing, and then I like figure out something, and then I'm just like kind of executing and creating and producing. And then I get this like stagnation that comes up. And then I'm like, okay, I have to switch something up. I have to switch my materials. I have to switch my scale. I have to maybe like totally like not do a circle.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Freaking circles. You know what I mean? Like you have to like almost like in a structured way, like limit yourself from what you were doing to open up a doorway to somewhere else. But it is, you're right, it is a scary place to be, especially as you become more developed as an artist and you have a certain style or a certain way of working that everybody's responding to really well. And, like they're expecting you to continue to like kind of pop those things out over and over again. And I find that that is a really tricky territory for a lot of artists to get into, especially as you become more successful or commercially viable. People are looking for your signature thing. And then sometimes you see artists where they just paint the same thing forever. And for some, maybe that is all you need to do. But I find that it kind of can suck the life out of the play and the creativity. And so something I personally struggle with, that I'm always trying to like find ways to cultivate opportunities for more play and experimentation in the studio.
Absolutely. It is. And, as you said, it's like, it is still important also to like, once you've kind of found like a groovy place to like hang out, like do that thing for a while. That's all right. It's like, it's like trusting the inside, when it's time to kind of change. But I imagine it does become a lot harder when people have a certain expectation of you to produce a certain type of thing. Feel beholden to that gets complicated.
It does.
Especially if like you do something well. I also do portraits, and I was doing that for a long time, like different types. And it's like, when I started to go a little bit more abstract, I felt like a disappointment in a way from people. But it's like, but you do that so well. Like what, and so it's like I find a balance. I still like work those in another practice in a way, but it's like that's that same kind of message lesson that keeps coming up is like, I don't want to be beholden to anyone else's expectations of what the art to be.
Yeah, it is such a tricky place to be, especially depending on where you are in your like life and your career, because there's so many practical sides to living too. But like at the end of the day, like I always have to like dig deep and really remember like why it is I'm doing this in the first place. And I find that like my art practice is an extension of all of my spiritual practices. Like there's not a separation between the two. I hold them in the same sort of degree of reverie and sacredness and treat them as such. And so being aware that like when you're in the studio, it's similar to me as when I'm sitting on my cushion meditating, and that like I have to really continually to dedicate myself to this process, to this practice, and really be there even when I feel like I don't want to be. And that's like one of the biggest things I think we can come up against, not even as artists, but as humans, is that inner resistance, this voice in our mind that just says like, you cannot do that today. You can do this instead, or you can go there. And it's tricky because sometimes you do want to listen to that, but then other times it can kind of like get you out of like your discipline in some ways. Like, and I find that to be a tricky thing as well. Do you ever deal with that too? Like this sort of like inner resistance in relation to like your spiritual practice or relation to your art practice that you always have to like be conscious of and try to like reset?
Oh my gosh, of course. Yeah, that's like the shadow side of the inner child, right? It's like I want to tap into the play and the experimentation and keep that alive. But the shadow side of that is like a little temper tantrum kind of kid digging her heels in and not in resisting change. Yes.
Yeah.
Alive,
I know. Yeah. But we have to integrate the shadow side. And I think that's something that collectively that we're dealing with, I think right now as a whole planet, it seems is like the shadow side of the collective consciousness has manifested through all these different individuals and forms and political systems and controversy. And it's forcing us to really have to grapple with the shadow. And I think that is such an important part of healing is being able to integrate the shadow side of our consciousness into the whole, like bring it back into the fold.
Yeah.
It's such a difficult experience. I feel like life is, and everyone can relate. I mean, like the
Yeah.
Buddha said, like life has suffering in it. Like it's
Yeah.
just inevitable. Like it's inevitable. It's par for the course here on planet Earth. I don't care who you are, where you come from, what you look like. Everyone's going to have their degree of strife and difficulty, but like it is the rich soil in which we can grow beautiful things. But sometimes I feel like it can be really hard to recognize that component of the shadow side. And I think artists in a lot of ways can be the ones to help facilitate that process of integration and growth through that. Not all artists work in that way, in terms of like kind of revealing the shadow sides and helping us grapple and integrate them. But I think that is an important component to spiritual practice. Just you and I both being really aligned in that we've kind of been on a similar path spiritually in terms of certain practices and modalities that we bring into our lives. Like that's something I see a lot happen in the yoga community is the what a lot of people are terming like spiritual bypassing,
Oh,
right?
that
Yeah.
was what was going through my head. So it's
Yeah.
like you can't skip past it. You can't
Mhm.
like, jump to the top of the ladder. You've got to, you have to integrate the shadow and go through all of that. And that is a process that takes
Yeah.
time. Not like you
Yeah.
just get to go to love and light or
Mm.
even stay in love and light if you ever get there. It's
Yeah.
like these myths of Persephone, and the changing of the seasons every year. I really, in recent years, like started tuning in and honoring that kind of turning of the wheel. And that's what that's all about. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
for death, there's a time for going inside, going under, going into like the darker places. And then there's the time for emerging and coming out. And it's like, it's in nature. All we have to do
Yeah.
continue to keep looking back to
Mm.
nature to see that.
Yeah. I know though. I mean, nature is the greatest teacher. I mean, you could sit in your backyard, your garden, or go to a park, and you can just have no agenda, but just to observe the changing world around you. And you're going to get the most immense lessons and wisdom you could ever really get from a book. If you're really paying attention, if you're really there centering and observing the constant flux of life, this sort of impermanent nature of reality all around us, like back into the point of like the shadow or the suffering that happens, like the grace within the suffering is that it does pass and it does leave behind opportunities for cultivating a greater sense of perspective, of wisdom. Really, for me, what my personal suffering that I've gone through in my life has really shown me this higher level of compassion towards others. Like it's the biggest lesson in compassion, not only compassion for myself, but for the world. But like the lesson of impermanence is such a beautiful one for me. For some, it can be very scary, this idea that nothing stays the same and things change all the time. But for me, that's like where the freshness is, right? Like that's where the play is. That's where the possibility lies in this experience that is impermanence, that is really colors our whole sort of path of life.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, it's like the moments in my life that I've had, like that the suffering has kind of overcome me, have been those moments when it's like this, I'm convinced this is the way it is now. This is what it's going to be like forever. And
Right.
that gaining that understanding of constant impermanence and change, it's like, that's a gift.
It is.
Healing.
It is such a gift because back to what we were talking about earlier with attachment,
Right.
you can't be, that's why attachment doesn't work.
Right,
That's
exactly.
what,
Yeah.
that
Because you
is,
can't, even if you try, even if like you wanted to do that, it's like
yeah,
it's not going to happen.
it's going to
You
change.
have to
Whatever
try
you're
through
holding
your
on to,
fingers.
exactly. Whatever you're holding on to, one way, shape, or form, it's going to evolve its sense and it's going to change. And this is just the nature of reality, the way that things just go. I love one of my favorite meditative practices is to just sit and use like listening as an experience of impermanence and then just note all the sounds happening around me, like all the different data points of sound that come into my consciousness, and just noticing how many subtle different sounds there are constantly percolating and changing every single moment. And it's like, there it is. There it is right there. There's impermanence. It's constantly there with us. So and it's sort of a paradoxical way. It's like the only, the whole cliche, the only constant is change. It's kind of true. I mean, as far as I've can grasp in this particular lifetime, and I do find it to be a place of refuge for me. And also in relation to the attachments in the studio as well, like whatever it is I'm working on this year or, today or, within the next couple of years, like I won't be working on that again, hopefully in a few years from now or 10 years from now. Like things are going to evolve. And I think that's something we can put our chips into, you know what I mean? Like things will change. And I think it's a beautiful lesson.
Yeah. And it's, Octavia Butler says, God is change. And it's like, I always like something about that was always like, yeah, that seems right. But I've been meditating on that a lot lately. And it's like, okay, if even this notion of a higher power, God is change itself, it's like that's mind blowing. That means like that means our conception of whatever that higher power is needs to continue to change. We need to continue to change.
Yeah.
Really gives us permission, I feel like, to relax into the moment. Because like you said, it's like, in your studio, you're working on this thing, you won't be in like 3 years. So it's like, yeah. So then that's what that whole like be in the present moment thing is about. Because it's that's it. You might as well. It's going to change.
Exactly. This is where life happens. Like you were saying, like when you were driving home from your yoga class and you could just feel your hands, you could actually just be in your car driving, not in your head. Yes. And I think that is the biggest revelation of, I feel like these kinds of practices is the incessant sort of like blabbering inside your head, like the constant judging, the constant critiquing, the constant, calculating, and these narratives and stories and fantasies and ruminations, like all these things happening inside. And it's like, when you start to like investigate the thought forms of your own mind, you realize that they are just like empty of any sort of concrete reality. There are these sort of like almost like apparitions or these hallucinations of some kind.
It's lunacy.
It is. I mean, they have use. Like there's certain thoughts like they have use. I think a big like point in my practice that like really helped transform things moving forward. There was like a crux point where I realized that like I can observe my thoughts outside of being in them. And I have the power to choose which thoughts I want to implement into my life and which ones I don't. Like every thought that crosses past your mind doesn't mean that's who you are or that's what you need to do. Like there is a choice point and there is a spaciousness that you can kind of cultivate between what I guess would be the awareness or the sort of pristine, clear consciousness and the thought forms themselves. And that was a big game changer to be able to cultivate an awareness of that space between those two components. It empowered me a lot to not be so victimized by my own thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why, I try to tell my students and remind myself over and over and over again throughout the day is that meditation, the practice of life, is not like emptying our mind of thoughts. It's just taking that one little step back, just one step back and becoming the observer of them instead of completely taken over and buying into, like you said, the illusion of whatever that monkey mind chatter is. And I have definitely, like gone through many, many years in my life where I really suffered listening to criticism inside. And it's been part of my art practice to let all of that go. So like utilize the it's like the good criticisms and the kind of the mentality of like which way this is going to go. It's not completely free form, but
like which thoughts are useful for you in this moment right now, for real? Like which ones for real are useful and which ones are a bunch of BS, and being able to parse that out and not be attached to the to the negative thought forms and try to like mistake them for who you are. I think that's the biggest difference sometimes when you begin this process is you start to shift your identity away from the thoughts themselves because a lot of times, like, we can be in, because I used to do this and I still see this happening in my mind, even, 15 years later, deep in practice, like I still see this happening in my mind where I'm equating like a certain thought to be the reality of who I am. I'm like saying like, oh, this thought is who I am. But
Right.
then you just laugh at yourself. You're like, duh, it's not. It's just this form, just like a bird, flying through the sky. Like it's there, but it's not
Yeah.
like there's nothing I need to do with it. It's just existent. It doesn't mean I have to like believe it or recognize it and utilize it. But like being able to not identify with those thoughts as a sense of who you are, like to not equate the quality of thoughts that go through your mind with the quality of your beingness or your human nature. Because I think that's something people struggle with too, is that they have these really negative thoughts or mean thoughts, evil thoughts, dark thoughts, and they
Yeah.
think that they're evil and dark. Like,
Yeah.
no, like these are just forms of thoughts. Like when you don't attach to those things, you recognize that that is not who you are. And that to me is a very like liberating moment, when you can recognize that.
Absolutely. And it's really like part of understanding that for me, it's been really integral to get at, well, where are some of these thoughts coming from? And look at that. Like it's like that, I was born into this world just pure consciousness. It's
Mm-hmm.
like we have taken on all of that, society, family, just it's like it's been programmed into our nervous systems over
Yes.
of our lives. And so it's been so important for me, and that's part of what the journaling practice is to like separate that stuff out. It's like, okay, that didn't come from me. This
Mm-hmm.
came from this or that. And it's like, okay, I'm gonna put that in the fire now, and I'll
Yes. Yeah,
to be
because yes, exactly. Because we do absorb so much consciously and unconsciously throughout our whole life. And there are certain thoughts, certain things that people have said to us, like in childhood or certain things that we said, like, oh, I guess that is who I am. Or like, oh, you're really good at that. Or you're really not good at that. And then you start to identify what other people are telling you about yourself as being true about who you are. And it's really, I think, the process of maturation in my mind is the process of dismantling these frameworks and these concepts and these programs that were not ours in the first place. It's so interesting. Like we do come into this world pure consciousness. Like I think about like my son when he was born, like he's just like the most pure, open, loving, peaceful, perfect little being right now who has very like base needs. But like I always like try to imagine like what life is like through his eyes without any sort of framework or concepts around reality. And then over time, it's like almost it's like I'm giving him the karma that he's going to have to work with later and everyone else around him. It's such a weird process.
and we all have to,
It's so
like
weird.
I
It's
imagine that's difficult as a parent to not be able to protect them from that.
yeah.
It's like, no, that's part of the human journey.
It is. It's part of it. It's like it's such a weird situation. It's like we have to take on all this crap so that we can learn how to let it all go.
Right.
And that's like almost like the school of the human life. I really love Ram Dass and like his teachings and the way that he sort of like really distilled Eastern wisdom traditions in sort of ways that us in the West can really understand and grapple. And I always love this sort of analogy that he creates around the idea of like Earth being a school and everyone's on a different curriculum and we're all
Yeah.
given a certain curriculum and like your job is not to do someone else's curriculum. Your job is to do your own curriculum. And I think that's a tricky part as well of this process is when you start to unfold and expand your consciousness, open your heart, and really like connect to this wider and wider relationship with reality. You want to scream it from a mountaintop. You want to get everybody to go to the yoga class. You want
That's
everybody to
right.
meditate. You want
Yep.
everybody to do this. And it's like, I remember the first like especially the first like 5 or 6 years of being like really deeply committed, like I would annoy the shit out of people because I would think that they should be doing all this stuff. And I would be like, oh, you got to try this, try that, do this, do that. And they're like, no,
Right.
you got to realize that you're ready when you're ready. And like you can't force these things into people's lives, but they are powerful, amazing things. But it's like when you try to get someone to go and take that curriculum when they're not ready, it does the opposite effect of what you're wanting.
Right. I did the same thing. I've been guilty of that same kind of shouting it from the mountaintops.
Yeah.
And, likewise, it's been really important for me as well to, when you find truth or you find a teacher, you find a community of people that, it's like it's healing, it's wisdom, but you don't have to take all of it for
Exactly.
yourself. Like that's not necessarily all for you. And that's that scary place again of being able to go inside and really listen to yourself and trust
Mm-hmm.
yourself. And that I feel like is such, because it was very, like with the yoga or like other spiritual practices I do, it's been very tempting to want to like force myself into certain models where
Mm-hmm.
it's like the scarier thing is to be like, okay, and that's what meditation does, or the journaling is like makes you kind of go back inside and be like, yeah, but what do you need? Like
Exactly.
what is your truth? And
Mm-hmm.
nobody else, like we all have, like you said, we all have our own.
Mm-hmm.
And so we all have to go on that journey by ourselves.
Yeah. I love what you were mentioning earlier. I forget who it was who said it about like God being change, like God
Yeah.
is change. And this is such a fascinating concept, like this sort of evolutionary principle that's encoded in life. Like things are designed to grow and bloom and expand and sort of like take another step in consciousness or expression in some way. And I think that right now we're in such an interesting moment because we have so much access to so many traditions of spiritual practice, so many lineages of ancient wisdom. And it's an amazing time because you can be able to learn things that if you were born 100 years ago or 200 years ago, where you were born, in this life, in Florida or whatever, you might not have ever seen a book on yoga, ever heard of anything like this. You were kind of stuck within whatever framework you were brought up in. But now
Yeah.
we live in this time of such cross pollination and such a breadth of access to these practices and this knowledge base. And so that, although it's incredible, I mean, I'm just grateful every single moment of my life that I've had access to learning these ideas and exploring them and practicing them. However, it's like we have to also be careful because these things are going to continue to evolve. So like what does spirituality look like moving into the 21st century? And
Right.
how it's not going to look like it looked in the ancient Western China
Yeah.
500 years ago, and or in India 3,000 years ago. It's not going to look that way. It's going to be something new. It's going to change. It's going to be a
Yeah.
new evolution of spiritual consciousness. And so it's a very exciting time. And so I think your point of like you don't have to take everything is such an important one, because I was like this in the beginning, and I see people get this way too. It's like where you just want to like, and it's for some people that's their curriculum. So I don't want to negate it, because some people that is the path, that is their karma, that's what they have to do in terms of following a strict lineage, a very
Right.
strict process. Like for example, like certain people who are into like Ashtanga yoga and
Sure.
like a very traditional form of Ashtanga yoga, like there's everything is very much, the path is pretty much laid out for you, and you have to really follow that to a T. Or like if you want to be a monk and go into like a Zen Buddhist tradition or a Tibetan Buddhist tradition or what have you, a certain lineage and approach and respect to tradition you have to have. But for a lot of us, that's probably not going to be our path.
Right.
But we're still going to be able to glean the wisdom and the practices and integrate it into the modern world. And I think that's this tricky place we're in right now. Is
Right.
like, how do we cultivate a real connection and respect for tradition and spiritual practice, while at the same time allowing it to evolve with the time so it can integrate with our culture in a holistic, healthy way, so that it can continue to spread its boons and its beauty and its love. And that's a big question that I have.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that is very important that we don't like throw out the baby with the bathwater in this process.
Exactly.
But it is, I mean, we can't even, our brains can't even comprehend right now. It's like where we're going. Things are changing so fast. It's like you mentioned Ram Dass and the access to everything. I was in high school, there still wasn't really the internet. And so someone had given me Be Here Now. And I'm like, what is this?
What?
I'm looking through it, this like girl in Florida, and I'm like, I don't know what this is, but I dig it. This is something that's great. And so it's like those little nuggets along the way that have kind of, formed this path, little hero's journey,
Exactly.
spirituality that I've been on.
Yes.
And then that access has expanded so much. I bring that up because it's like, I'm just looking at even, AI with like all the digital, it's like that just hit. And now it's already changed so much. I'm like, I don't think our brains can keep up.
I know.
That's happening. It's happening so fast.
It is. It is. It makes me think of, are you aware of who Terrence McKenna was? He was like a sort of he's a very like cultural figure now. Like you can find a lot of his talks and stuff. He was a kind of a psychedelic psychonaut renaissance man from like the 70s and the 80s. And like he was really interested in like sort of like the futurism and where technology is going to take us, but really connected with like sacred practice in relation to psychedelics. And he theorized this notion of like how the universe is always trying to create novelty, like continuous form of novelty. And it's just going to become increasingly more novel until it gets to some sort of like choice point where everything just kind of like explodes into oneness. And right. So I feel like everything he talked about, like we are kind of seeing right now in terms of the novelty of like AI, right? And like what the implications of something like that has, not only for society, for art, for everything, right. Like as teachers, like we've been talking about AI because like, what do we do when like kids can just get an essay written by them on chat GPT, or they can create incredibly fantasy artwork, through right. these AI models. Like, so I think we're still trying to like figure all that out. But at the same notion, like I'm not like a Luddite by any sense. Like I think technology is really important and cool and actually could really help us grapple with a lot of the problems we have. But in the same token, I worry about the way that technology is integrated into our daily life and keeps us from being present, from being here now, from being able to tap into the wonder and mystery of the natural world, because we're so locked into our phones. We're so locked into the social media verse. And so it's like, how are we going to handle the evolution of that is another interesting thing I have. And I think that's why I think the more technological we get, we need to balance that with more like material, like practical experiences, like walking in nature, like going out and feeling the earth and the dirt on your skin, like or making art out of physical materials, and going to see art in person, and going to galleries and museums more as a way to counterbalance sort of the digital experience that we have with imagery. We need that more than ever.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. One of the schools I teach at recently changed their curriculum so that it's so much more digital. And I've always taught in like the analog practices of drawing, even design before you get into the computers, watercolor. And I just like, even in like the last 3 years, I've been thinking a lot about it because I'm like, these students, this like may be their only few hours out of the day where they're disconnected from a machine.
Right.
That's like a sacred space. And I feel like super like, honored to be able to hold that space. But even then it's hard for them. It's hard for me. I found myself scrolling, getting into that world. I was like, wait, what are you doing?
I know.
Yeah, which is why it's also so exciting that this kind of like spiritual renaissance is happening too, because it's like we need it more than ever.
Definitely.
And we need tools of going back inside. The yoga class is one of those things too, where it's like phones are left outside of the room. And it's like an hour and a half doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but it's a huge deal. Like when how much we're spending on these machines. And there's people too. It's like we need to pay attention to the fact that there is a group of people that have a vested interest in us staying on those machines and continuing to look outwardly for the answers instead of inwardly.
Yeah, I mean, we have some of the smartest engineers and psychologists and marketers all teaming up together to get you to be addicted to these things for the sake of profitability, advertising, really, to get you to be a consumer more and more and more. And so, yeah, it is a very uphill battle that we have to fight here. But I think that practices like the analog practices, like you're talking about, like really painting, really drawing, really using materials, really building with your hands, those are going to be really important. And you can do both. It's not like you just have to do that. Like you can still do, the 3D printing and the computer models and the computer coding. You can do all that too. That's great. But like, make sure we're balancing ourselves by being in touch with like real physical experiences and practical materials. The analog is so important. I used to teach an analog photography class before we had to get rid of a darkroom that we were using. And the kids' mind were just blown away when I was teaching them about black and white photography. Like they're like, Mr. Benson, like spent like, 3 weeks making this one photo. Isn't this amazing? I'm like, yes, it's incredible.
That's so cool.
Yeah, because it's like they can make a photo in a split a second right now on their phone, but like it gets them to slow down. That's why I teach analog, I teach painting and drawing and printmaking and all these things. And I want the students to be able to have that experience at least once a day, or, like a few times a week, slowing down, working with their hands, working with materials, not looking into a screen. Because I just think that's going to be increasingly more important. And you mentioned like the spiritual renaissance, like it is such a powerful time, but it's such a contentious time. And I think that is part of like the fireworks of creation, right? Like think about like a supernova. Like it's not a peaceful, beautiful, like, serene moment. It's a very explosive, dynamic thing. And so I almost see what's happening collectively, culturally, as being an illustration of that. And so we have to be able to accept that reality, that it's going to be a difficult road, but we do have these maps. We do have these traditions. We do have these practices. We do have this sort of lineage of creativity and art to help ground us and guide us and sort of help lead us along this really uncharted territory that we're going through. And that's why I look to artists like you and so many other artists out there who are exploring consciously their spirituality through art making, who are dedicated and devoted to like working with materials and kind of creating this expressive space where people might be able to have a gleam of an insight into what that is like to look within, or to think about awe and mystery and majesty. Like this is a really important role that I think artists have to play in our culture. And so I see just so many artists who are thinking about these things that we're talking about today and are creating work in response to these practices or response to these ideas. And to me, that gives me so much hope and excitement, because it's like, who knows where this thing could go?
Me too, man. I wish I had this podcast when I was like in art school or high school. It's like, but my personal journey was to have to kind of like get there through a lot of suffering on my own, to a place where it's like, you know what, I'm gonna make what I'm gonna make, and then to feel this through, I mean, even social media, like you said, it's like none of these like electronics tools are bad or good. It's not about the binary, it's about how we use them.
Yes, definitely.
And so I'm so grateful for Instagram and podcast in ways where it's like I feel like I'm sort of finding my people,
right? Yeah, that's what I think, that is one of like the beauties of the internet and of social media, is that you can cultivate community in a way that has never been cultivated before, because community and historically is really based on like who you are in proximity to. But now like our community can expand the globe in terms of shared interests, shared ideas, and shared outcomes, like the things that we all kind of in our hearts want to see happen, which is more beauty, more love, more equity, more inclusion, more connectivity, more balance, less, you know what I mean? Like I think at the end of the day, we all want the same thing.
You know what strikes me is that, like, because people talk, there's a lot of energy given to like the divisiveness that's happening now, and it's there. Like, of course, it's happening. But what strikes me with all of this content, all these social media platforms, podcasts, is that we actually can't get enough of each other. You know, it's like we're dying to connect with each other. We listen,
Yes.
like we want to connect with each other so much that we'll sit in our cars listening to people we don't know have conversations. Like, we're on social media connecting. And it's like, that's actually kind of beautiful to me. And
It
it's like, I think
is.
this is happening, but look at what's also happening, you know?
Exactly. It's so easy for media to be able to like funnel our experience of what the world is through these lenses of divisiveness, because like when you look at like a media clip, you could think that that's representative of the whole world.
Right.
This terrible
Yeah.
experience, this terrible moment. But like there's, if you really just look around your neighborhood, look around your city, walk around and just look, you're going to see probably a lot of beautiful things all around you all the time. And so we can't forget that, because I think the media is so powerful that it can trick us to believing that every single experience on the earth is horrific and horrible and everyone is doomed, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
that's not really actually what the reality is showing us if you're really paying attention. So we have to be very, very careful there. But I love what you're saying. Like, we are dying to connect with each other. We are social beings. Like, this is part of our makeup. This is why humans are still here on this planet all these years later, is because we need each other. We need each other to survive. Like, we are here to help cultivate an environment where everybody can succeed in some way, in terms of, in my mind, success is like happiness, well-being, and safety. Like, we can, and having your needs met here, like, and I think community is one of those basic needs. It's
Yeah.
one of
Oh,
our basic needs. And it's a loneliness epidemic out there. And I think we have a lot of work to do to help bring people who are on the outposts into the fray and back into the community, or that sense of community. That's really what transforms society.
yeah, absolutely. I think that we're going, and a lot of the kind of teachers I'm paying attention to right now, it's like the focus is community. It's like
Mhm.
that's how we're going to get there now, it's starting with the self being the change that you want to see, and then also like connecting and creating a sense of community. It's like that's how that
Yeah.
just not necessarily relying on the government to like change it for us. It's like we have to start building the world that we want to see now,
Yes.
small
Exactly.
ways every day with our
100%. I mean, it's like all these little, throughout the day, we have a million choices that we make all day long.
yeah.
Little mundane choices like, do I want water or do I want tea? Do I want, am I ready for lunch now or am I not? Like all these little choices that we can make all day long. But like that is, every choice we make builds up to like this bigger picture. And so if we can create sort of an environment and create a culture where people are making choices for well-being, not only of themselves but of the whole, like these little tiny choices that they make throughout the day, if they're bringing into their consciousness not only their own needs but the needs of the collective in some small simple way, like that creates such a huge impact. And so that sense of like belonging is so important. Like, you are not alone. Like, we are interrelated, interdependent with the entirety of life, and no one is separate from any of it. And so I think that's part of what we do down here on planet Earth, is to figure out the language and figure out the ways in which, the practices in which we can create deeper and deeper awareness of our own interconnected reality. And I think art does that. I think our culture does that through various ways, but also like just being present in the world does that. Just being here now, right?
Right,
Like,
showing up.
yeah, like that's really what's gonna do it. And it's not going to be one big thing that's going to change the world. It's going to be a lot of these little choices that we are all making. And
Yeah.
so I think if we can become more and more conscious of those kinds of patterns of decisions that we make, then we can start making better decisions that will ultimately help not only ourselves but everybody. Because when you help someone else, you're helping yourself, because there is no separation on that fundamental level. Like I think about circling back to your artwork, right? Like the painting, like there's this structure, there's this web of interconnected life. And from that, there's individuation that sprouts from it, individual expressions, unique organic movements, but they're all still grounded in this inherent structure that can never be broken, never be separated. And so we have to own our individuality and enjoy it and express it and be in it, but not be attached to it to the point that we forget our interdependent nature with everyone else. And I think that is the practice, whether it's art, and just that's the practice of life, is being able to bring those things together. And so I love being able to see the way you do it in your artwork. And I'm super excited to see where this new body of work goes. So everybody out there, I'm going to have in the show notes links to all of Katie's work. Definitely give her a follow on Instagram, and any other information that you want me to put in the show notes, just let me know and I'll put it there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Martin. This has just been such an exhilarating conversation.
I know. I feel like we could keep going forever. We hit an hour and I feel like we're coming back into that point, talking about, and I think we're going to have to run it back. We're going to have to circle back and do part 2 at some point, because I think there's a lot for you and I to continue to unpack and discuss. And in the meantime, I'm just really excited to see all the work that's going to be coming out of your studio. So keep it up and keep doing what you're doing. It's really, really impressive and really inspiring and beautiful. So
thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
We'll connect soon. All right, Katie?
All right. Sounds good, Martin.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Peace. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Concerning the Spiritual and Art. If you like what we're doing here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stay in touch and in tune with all the amazing offerings that we're going to be bringing to this channel. Thanks again for all your support. Super grateful, and excited to bring more content your way. Peace, y'all.